Today we are looking at the ideas of times and seasons. So welcome to the fourth of my videos for the St Olave's Lent course. We can start with the question, why do we worship on Sunday? Reading the very earliest material, it's clear that the first Christians gathered on the first day of the week. Well, the Romans didn't have a week, so we are immediately in a Jewish context. St Paul tells the Corinthians to collect money for the poor in Jerusalem on the first day of the week. Obviously, the day that they gather. Now that was written probably in the early 50s. Several decades later, St Luke writes, "On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them. Since he intended to leave the next day, he continued speaking until midnight." Now, by our reckoning, was this Saturday night or Sunday night? The probability is that they kept the Jewish system that the day began at sunset. So the sunset prayers are the beginning of the day. This is where we get the idea of a first evensong, that the feast begins the previous evening. Certainly in Eastern Christianity, the day begins at sunset, which is also evensong. So if you say, "Where are you celebrating?" and "When are you celebrating?" they will say, well, the name of the church, and they will celebrate at evensong or vespers. In any case, Sunday, however we reckon it, was the usual meeting day of Christians well before the New Testament had been written. It was connected with the Sabbath from the start. And a letter to the Emperor Trajan talks about meeting twice. And that could be the Saturday for synagogue study of the scriptures, and then in the evening when the Christians celebrated a Eucharistic feast. But it's all guesswork. Sunday became the day of assembly, not a day of rest. It was a new concept, but how was it understood by them? Well, quickly it was called the Lord's Day, and this was the day on which John receives his vision. "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day," he says. The gathering on that day was not so much a celebration of past events, Christ's resurrection, but the eschatological readiness for Christ's coming. His imminent coming permeates the whole of a Christian's prayer and life. In the Syriac tradition, the chalice and the paten, the wherewithal for celebrating the Eucharist, are always left on the altar, or throne as they call it. They're there because we must always be in readiness to celebrate the Eucharist. So we must always be ready to meet Christ in the same way. Interestingly, the Sabbath continued to have a very special place in early Christianity because you were never allowed to fast on Saturday as it was the Sabbath celebration, no matter how great the fast, except the day before Easter. So Sunday was from the beginning a day of gathering, the day when the holy people of God gathered to look forward to God's rescuing. Now, 1700 years ago this week, Constantine, the great son of York, required that everybody except farmers should rest from their work. This was a radical new idea. It was not something that the Christians had been particularly asking for. But by 321, most churches had moved the Eucharist from being in the evening to be in the morning, and it was no longer set within a community meal. There seems to have been a Saturday evening service which now had become a Vigil of the Resurrection, but Sunday as we know it, with the main Eucharist in the morning, was clearly fixed 1700 years ago. It's worth thinking for a moment about the whole concept of time. For St Paul, time is related to his ideas about the body. The human body, he insists, is a body of decay. From the moment of birth, we are moving in a decline to our death. But as the resurrection people, we are moving away from what he calls the body of this death. We are part of a glorious body, and our gathering as the body of Christ is looking forward away from entropy towards glory. Things can only get better. Worship is about hope, about God rescuing us from our slavery to sin. That is why I suggest it's so important to have a real confession said together at the beginning of the Eucharist. We recognise that here, as we gather together, we are a people, part of this world bound by sin. But by the end of the Eucharist, we have been fed with glory. Sunday, the Lord's Day, is an anticipation of the day of the Lord. It's quite an interesting phrase. The prophet Amos, back in the 8th century BC, spoke of the day of Yahweh, the day of the Lord. For the people of Samaria, it was, he describes, a day to party. Alas for you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? If that was the case for Amos, then the early Christians saw it as something completely different. The day of the Lord is a day of hope and liberation. But medieval Christianity turned it into the day of wrath, a day of fear. God becomes a day of condemnation. A God of condemnation, so worship is a way of bribing God. Here I give you this sacrifice, so don't hit me. The Church makes the attendance of the Eucharist as an obligation, so that instead of celebrating God's victory, it is a matter of ticking boxes. I remember asking an Antiochian Orthodox priest in Damascus about holy days of obligation. When do you have to go to church? He was completely flummoxed. Clearly people had no sense of obligation, and each locality had its own extra feasts. So one town outside Damascus partied on the birthday of the Mother of God, and another a week later on the Feast of Holy Cross. It was all about celebrating. We worship on certain days, says that Byzantine tradition, looking forward to the victory of Christ. It's worth looking for a moment at Easter. From very early on, there was a struggle about when Easter should be celebrated. Should it be fixed, whatever the day of the week, according to when the 15th of Nisan, Passover, fell, or should it be on a Sunday, the day of resurrection? And there were disagreements about when the vigil took place and when the fasting ended. Was it at midnight or at cockcrow with a resurrection Eucharist? Whatever it was a whole set of events, and the Jewish Passover was the basis of Easter. After all, the word in most languages for the feast of Easter, the celebration of the death and resurrection of Jesus, is Passover, Pesach, Pac, Pasc in Welsh and so on. And the whole death and resurrection was celebrated in the vigil on the Saturday night. And by around 250 AD the date was fixed. It was the Sunday after the 15th. This was more clearly fixed under Constantine. But Easter was the Sunday which commemorates Christ's passion. In many ways it celebrated both the death and the resurrection. It was not so much, as we have it today, a celebration of historical events, but rather of the idea of the sacrificial death and then the triumph of Jesus Christ, our God. The West, though, led by Rome, was always a bit of an innovator. It moved away from the Jewish origins of Passover and tied Easter more to the spring equinox. But Eastern churches are always fixed in the old way. In fact, Rome has consistently moved away from original practices. In architecture, it dropped the universal practice of an orientation towards the East. It frequently forgot what was the universal practice. What is always clear, whether you're in an ancient church in Persia or a new one in Australia, is that there is a concept of sacred time. It might seem to be looking back to the events of the Incarnation, but from the beginning there is a looking forward to the day when we rest in the Lord. As the letter to the Hebrews has it, so then, a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. For those who enter God's rest also cease from their labours as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one may fall through such disobedience. Thank you all very much.